Hi guys, it's Alistair McKenzie here, sports physiotherapist from the UK, and welcome back to Research Unpacked from the Informed Performance podcast. On today's episode, we have part 3 with Dr. Tim McGrath. Tim is an Australian sports physiotherapist with over 20 years of clinical and research experience. He is the founder of Elite High Performance Rehab in Canberra and the director of Australian-based company Pitch Ready. In parts 1 and 2, Tim discussed his PhD research on outcome measures following ACL reconstruction. He also shared some of his perspectives on constructing an ACL rehab program, which provides some great clinical insight and tips to inform your practice. In part 3, Tim is going to discuss a more recent paper on the determinants of hamstring fascicle length in professional rugby league athletes, which was published in 2020 in the Journal of Science and Medicine in Sport.
This episode of the Informed Performance podcast has been sponsored by Vol Performance, makers of the Force Frame. Used by health and performance professionals for assessing and improving performance and rehabilitation, the Force Frame is a powerful solution for quickly and accurately testing isometric strength and imbalances. In addition to testing athletes, the Force Frame is also used to maintain and improve strength, offering over 130 isometric training protocols. As a portable and easy-to-use system, the Force Frame is designed to ensure every measurement can be accurately and reliably measured, time after time again. To learn more about the Force Frame, visit our sponsor, volperformance.com.
You're listening to Research Unpacked from the Informed Performance podcast with me, Alistair McKenzie, and here is today's episode with Tim McGrath. Tim, thanks for coming back on for your final part of your series.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
On today's episode, we're going to move away from ACL rehab and on to another hot topic in sports science and medicine, which is all things hamstrings. So this paper you published a couple of years ago, and you looked to establish the determinants of hamstring fascicle length in pro rugby league players. So what was the origin behind this paper?
I was working in professional AFL at the time, and the club that I was at had a bit of a hamstring problem, and the high performance manager, a guy by the name of Darren Burgess, sort of in an effort to try and sort of get some insights into why it was happening, was to bring in a guy named Ryan Timmins, who did his PhD in fascicle lengths. And the first that I tell Tim about this all the time, the first time I heard about it, that someone was going to come in with an ultrasound machine and start measuring things, I was horrified, because I'd sort of come from the real-time ultrasound of multifidus and transverse abdominis and all that sort of stuff, and I was a bit scarred by that experience. So as soon as I heard there was a guy with an ultrasound coming in, I was very negative about the whole thing. But his stuff is brilliant. You'll see, in sport all the time, there are people that can have speed spikes, people that don't have speed spikes, people who are strong, people who are weak, and not necessarily holding up very well with the ones that then do a hamstring in football. And as where his stuff did held up really well, people who had short fascicles, they probably needed one of those other little factors to come in on top. But people that had, long fascicles weren't the ones that weren't doing hamstring. So through his kind of work, it sort of held up reasonably well that it was an important thing to look at. And then it became about chasing fascicle lengths. So what's in terms of dosage, what's a good dose? Is it more is better? Is there a sort of a minimum threshold? A lot of those things, and Nordics tend to feature pretty prominently within that. And then you got groups that then talk about we don't need Nordics, and there's other ways of sort of changing strength. So it was all these sort of competing opinions as to what actually kind of helped chase fascicle lengths, and never really got resolution, when I was at that place. But then started up as a medical director at a NRL rugby league club, and I was pretty keen to then sort of use that as an opportunity to sort of try and chase some of these qualities. So we set up the project where we captured just about every metric you can in professional sport, everything from Nordic count to injury history, to age to speed, GPS derived speed loads over, over the preceding sort of 2 months, all the way through the season, and got their fascicles at repeat periods of the time. So it was a good project to do, because I'd sort of learned a lot of the technical parts from the PhD in terms of setting up a project that meant you could sort of capture data along the way without making it too onerous on the program, but then still having pretty good rigor at the time.
Yeah, Ryan has published a lot of work around hamstrings, and he worked closely with David Opar, who was on the main show with Ben quite a while ago, but he discussed a lot of his literature around, the quadrant of doom and stuff like that. So I really recommend, if anyone's interested, to go back and find that episode and have a listen. But back to this paper, you had 33 elite rugby league players, all male, that were tested during pre and in-season time points. And we know things like eccentric strength is prominent in the literature, but what were the determinants that you observed with regards to changes in fascicle length?
Yeah, I think that was key. I think that was key, is that eccentric strength features very prominently when people think about, fascicle lengths and hamstring prevention, all that sort of stuff. But like speed features as prominently, if not more prominently, than eccentric strength. So both of them are that showed up to be very important, like the both of them did. But it was, and the other part with the speed was, everyone talks about 90% thresholds, chronic exposure above, and we looked at the 90%, how much speed exposure they had chronically over 90%, and it didn't even come up as a strong correlation at all. It was all about 80%. So, for since that point, I've been very comfortable not having to chase that, magic 90% sort of mark. As long as they're getting a chronic exposure of high speed running, then for me, that's the most important part. From a strength perspective, we looked at break, again, with all the biomechanical aspects, we had break angles, everything from 20 degrees thigh angle velocity all the way through to peak thigh angle velocity. So we were trying to look at, does break angle correlate? Because that's been talked about over time, where, you end up having to have people have to be in a really low position when they do it, and being really strict with, hip positions, tucking your butt in and all that sort of stuff. And really it was just about the time under load. So it was peak loads, and just the time under load was important. Not the break angle didn't kind of show up as an important factor.
Yeah, that's interesting. And for me, reading the paper, that was one of the key takeaways, is that time under tension during or closing in on a super maximal contraction may have the potential to produce a more potent stimulus to drive adaptation, rather than the athlete's breaking angle, which is discussed a lot in the literature, which we know probably correlates to when near peak force happens, but that's also influenced by contextual factors like intent and effort and so on, and fatigue. But from your study, then, really it's just saying that it's really important to consider time under tension as a key variable when prescribing Nordics.
Absolutely, that's my interpretation of it. Because certainly people who had the longer their ability to sustain that time from sort of 20 degrees. So 20 degrees is you're starting to move forward, and then you're just starting to fall. So that's generally 20 degrees per second. So the longer the time period was between that to peak thigh angular velocity, the longer that was, the stronger the correlation with long fascicle lengths was.
Yeah, and it's interesting here, and you talk about 80% high speed exposure. There is a bit of a debate whether it's 80 or 90% exposure to get a minimal dose, and obviously if it can be done at 80%, then you're probably creating a safer environment for your athletes, especially during condensed fixtures and high intensity training sessions. So that's an interesting finding that can be applied from both injury prevention and athletic development. But what minimal dosage do you recommend for the Nordic, if you're considering time under tension as well?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and what was another good sort of inadvertent part about it was because we got a time series. So we didn't just get one moment in time. We had repeat sort of measures, and Timo, he collects data from everywhere, from AFL to English Premier League to everywhere. So he's got a good sample. So within this group, they had the group average, if you like, was the longest of all the groups that he had. So in terms of the volume, we were sort of doing, because we had debates in the AFL about, is 3 reps within a week versus 9 reps, all that sort of stuff. This group was tolerating, 2 sets of 5 double leg and 1 set of 3 single leg twice a week. So they were tolerating volumes within the 20 to 25 range, depending on whether it was a short turnaround or a long turnaround. This cohort, not only the classic thing was that typically they decline once they get into in-season. So their fascicles are the longest at the sort of the end of the pre-season period, and then decline as it gets into the in-season period is where this group increased as they went, which is sort of bucked a bit of the trend on the data that he had, and had the highest sort of group average fascicle length across the board. So I think it's useful in the sense that it means then that it's a good representative group as well as to what correlates to it, rather than it just being this was a really poor group, compared to the other sort of groups that he'd measured.
Yeah, and I think that brings us nicely on really to reflection of the methods of this study. So were there any limitations or anything you would do differently if you could reproduce this study?
I think I was pretty happy with it in terms of the outputs that you could derive from that group. Like I said, multiple time periods, any of those sorts of things can sort of help solidify the strength of your data. But in terms of the time period that we allocated and the how robust the study was, it was I feel like it's helped me in terms of the programming aspects and the things that I feel are important, in terms of hamstring prevention.
Yeah, that's always good to have that much confidence, and I agree. I think it's a pretty robust study, which, like you said, increases the confidence in the findings and the clinical implications of that. So, yeah, if we were just to conclude this study with some key points for the listeners, what kind of things would you go for?
Don't just prioritize strength only, speed, exposure, and keeping an athlete getting repeat, keeping them in training as much as humanly possible, because I think there's definitely a level of resilience that comes in with that, is where, some of I feel like the misinterpretations of load management over the years was as soon as someone has any kind of a spike, then they're going to hurt themselves and to back off. I don't think that's how the people who derived that work wanted it to be interpreted, but I think that that's how it got, received by different sort of clinicians. So as where from mine is, it's about keeping them in training. So rather than getting spooked by things, it's about the ability to sort of keep them in there. And for me, it was very much about running exposure is really important. And like you were saying before, is that the strength capacity is really about tissue tolerance, and having good strength tolerance means that you can confidently then, keep them within drills, and you can help build up that kind of resilience. And it's probably the two of them together which address a lot of those big rocks in terms of your prevention, is where programs that I've known where people do get easily spooked, and someone reports a bit of tightness and then they pull them out of the drill. I think that's potentially, resting them completely can do them a disservice, I reckon.
Yeah, and just quickly, with regards to returning from running from injury from a hamstring strain, I'm not sure what classification system you use out there, but we mainly use the BAMIC here, the British Athletics Muscle Injury Classification. So say you have a standard proximal bicep femoris injury, like a 1A or 2A myofascial based injury, compared to one with tendon involvement.
Yep.
When would you start running them again, and what are your thoughts around that?
So I think it was interesting when you work in AFL in Australia versus the rugby codes, that they're quite differently derived in terms of the conditioning program. So the rugby codes place a really high priority on strength. The AFL codes are a bit more aligned with a lot of your other sort of football codes that they prioritize running first, and I think that there's merit in both of them. So tendinous-based injuries, the rugby model I think tends to work really well, where you try and put a high priority on getting as much strength into them before you start trying to expose them to high speed, as opposed to so I tend to go with more the rugby model in that respect, as where in the AFL model, which is as soon as they're walking pain free, start getting to do a walk jog, let them self-select the speed, don't really dictate things too much. So if it's more of a muscle-based injury, then I will sort of let it flow like that. As where if it's a tendon-based one, I might still let them get into low level running, but really want some evidence of, kind of not necessarily super maximal, and it depends on whether it's a really high grade injury and a chronic injury or that sort of stuff, but definitely probably prioritizing the strength aspect a little bit more before I start getting too carried away with high speed running, just because I've been burnt. That's where those tendon ones burn you, is they look pretty good at low level, and then you start trying to hit high velocity, and that's when it unravels really easily.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's pretty much bringing us to a conclusion for your series, Tim. So thanks again for coming on the show. I've really enjoyed. We've covered a lot of different areas on ACL rehab and hamstring strain. So thanks for your time. I'm really looking forward to staying up to date with your research and hopefully get you back on when that gets published again.
Easy. Yeah, and then hopefully borders up soon, and then I can get back over that way sometime soon.
I'd like to say a big thank you to Tim McGrath for coming on the show, providing us with a lot of great research and clinical experience all wrapped into one. So I hope you really enjoyed his episodes and his series. To find out more from Informed Performance content, head to informedperformance.com, where you can find all our episodes as well as articles and courses from top professionals in performance and sports medicine. And don't forget, you can find us on social media at Informed Performance on Instagram or at InformedPod on Twitter. Thanks for listening to today's show of Research Unpacked. Catch us next time for more performance and sports medicine insights.